That raises a couple of other issues too, is because it seems to me that Barack Obama practiced an inordinate amount of respectability politics. That there was, and which makes a lot of sense in the context of the way that he was viewed and what he was supposedly represented, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder how much of BLM's of that change, of that understanding of, like, because when I hear the respectability politics as you describe it in the context of this of the civil rights struggle, there's a parallel track of like Clean for Gene, right? Like that was happening at the time too, but it was within the context of the white world, and it was not in some ways weaponized in the way to cleave off. Although there is still, we still have this concept of hippie punching, I guess, within the context of the Democratic Party, but it was still not weaponized in the exact same way that it's been weaponized in the Black community. And where you have Barack Obama saying, like, the real problem is that Black men have to deal with their kids, or, you got to be your brother's keeper stuff. And it creates this dynamic that, like, if there was a white version of Barack Obama, that guy, you could only be Barack Obama if you were that version of a person, right? Incredibly articulate, amazingly eloquent, good looking, just all that has the great story, et cetera, et cetera. You can attain what Barack Obama did, obviously, if you're far less sort of, I guess, of a person than Obama. I mean, look at Donald Trump, or this, but that's the whole point, right? Is that, like, you're not being measured in the same within the same spectrum, I guess.
I couldn't agree more. I really agree. Barack Obama really illustrates the limits of respectability politics, approaches to social problems and civil rights for Black folks in, the modern times, because a lot of people after his election were talking about we're in a post-racial America, right? And it was on his watch that Black Lives Matter was birthed, right? And it's because of the kinds of limits that were on his version of change and progress. And, you're right. He did go down to Morehouse and at their graduation lecture these, graduating young Black men who had exhibited great personal responsibility to get to graduation day, irrespective of whatever, one of the most respected Black, historically Black colleges in the country. They worked hard to get there. And he lectured them on, not making excuses and embracing personal responsibility. He didn't lecture the, other college students when he was at other campuses, when he wasn't talking to Black, predominantly Black audiences, right? So yeah, that politics of respectability way of thinking about things is holding us back. And we're never going to be able to make, this is one of the other main points in this book, Sam, we're never going to make deep cuts and racialized mass incarceration from that perspective, because contrary to what Michelle Alexander said in the new Jim Crow, most incarceration is not driven by low-level nonviolent drug offenders. Most people in state prisons, which is where 87% of prisoners reside, most of them are there for violent and serious offenses. It would be so much easier if they were just low-level nonviolent drug offenders. Yes, we could all come to an easy consensus on, yes, we should release them, right? What makes deep cuts and racialized mass incarceration so challenging is that isn't the case, factually, right? And that's what I'm trying to correct, that factual error at the heart of Michelle Alexander's new Jim Crow, that really it's low-level nonviolent drug offenders that accounts for the explosion from 1980 of 300,000 prisoners to 2.2 million in the aughts. No, it's violent offenders and serious offenders. That's a sad reality. And we need a new moral framework, a new compass, a new politics, and a new a way of thinking about law to accommodate that reality if we really want to make deep cuts in racialized mass incarceration.
So it's basically challenging the notion that this is going to be easy and fit into sort of that there is, it's questioning it's basically saying that the injustice is not in, I guess, who is in prison. The injustice is in what society has constructed, that the prisons are sort of like a second order almost manifestation of that problem that is being obscured. If you only look at like, there's only low level of, that you're worried about the low level offenders.
Yes, it allows you to achieve deep cuts in mass incarceration on the cheap. And I'm saying you can't do it on the cheap. You can't do it comfortably within your conventional moral framework. You're going to have to move away from retribution, retaliation, and revenge as your primary way of thinking about violent and serious offenders, which is how we've been doing it for the last 30, 40, 50 years, and move toward restoration, redemption, reconciliation, rehabilitation. Right? That's a kind of fundamental shift. You're going to have to tame the retributive urge that you feel to punish, wrongdoers. I'll give you one quick example, Sam. When Amber Geiger shot Botham John, a young black man sitting in Dallas. She was a white police officer, came in the wrong apartment. He was eating ice cream, stepped it up, shot him dead. She made a negligent mistake. She thought she was going into her apartment. She was on the wrong floor, right? I'll go in and say that was a negligent, stupid mistake, right? But a lot of people on my timeline elsewhere were saying, she deserves a murder conviction, which is what she ultimately got. And I was saying, well, manslaughter, I think, would be enough. Really, it was dumb, but for negligent and even reckless homicides, typically manslaughter is what we do. And I understand the urge because you have a victim from a socially marginalized group and you have a victimizer from kind of a dominant group, and you want to, show that you care for the victim's rights by, punishing the victimizer as much as possible. But we're never going to make deep cuts in mass incarceration if we have that attitude toward Amber Geiger, because it's going to hurt more blacks than non-blacks, because blacks are the ones disproportionately swept up in the criminal justice system. So we have to tame that retributive urge, even when it hurts, even when we don't want to a lot of time, even when it's victimizers from more dominant groups. We still have to work on a new moral compass.
Okay, so if I mean, and frankly, though, I mean, I can hear a lot of people saying like, okay, why should we? Right? I mean, from like, why should we as a society, not have some measure of like to be overly, to be oriented in that way towards people who commit violent crime? Like, why should we?
Right. That's exactly it. For a long time, we say, look, these are people who are sometimes preying on the most vulnerable members of their own society, of our own community, right? Why shouldn't we just, treat them with so much toxic human waste and dump them and forget about them, right? We tried that for 30 years, Sam, and look at what it got us, right? It hasn't, we haven't been making progress with these problems. For one thing, these people do come back out eventually, right? And we want them to come back out and be, feel like they have a stake in our society still, that they have something to get up for and to strive for. And so, I hear that, but I also recognize that what I hear people saying all the time is redemption, reconciliation, restoration, especially in my faith, Sam. My mother was Catholic. I was raised in that tradition of, on Sunday mornings, you're talking redemption, reconciliation, restoration. And then Monday through Saturday, people go back to retribution, retaliation, and revenge. Right. And then Sunday, they're redemption, restore. I want to take Sunday from that my tradition and spread it throughout the week. Have the same moral compass throughout the week.
But so is it a moral argument or is it an efficacy argument? Or is it both?
Good, both. It's absolutely both. I sometimes I have to make the efficacy argument to folks who really can't get to the moral argument, because a lot of times some of the studies I go into the book suggest that you don't really feel like making allowances for someone unless you empathize with them. And at an unconscious level, we just don't empathize with Black people, right? If you're not, I have these studies like when you look at what happened in Hurricane Katrina, with those black people standing on those rooftops for 4 days with water up to their neck. Not 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, Sam. 4 days in, Sean Penn was rolling in, handing out fresh water because FEMA still couldn't get their acts together. Compare that response. Those black lives didn't matter. They didn't generate empathy. They didn't generate a panic of empathy. Compare that response to what happened after 9/11 when those planes ran into those buildings. There was a panic of empathy for those victims. Nobody wanted to hear about any red tape, bureaucratic impediments. We just got it done, right? And that's what, is really depressingly coming out of these studies that I look at in this book, that when I walk down Skid Row here in LA, for example, the fiercest expression of structural violence in America, Sam, the highest concentration of homeless folk in America, you look around you, 75% of the faces are black. Not people of color, black. And that's basically Hurricane Katrina. You have families out there, tinsel there. That's basically people in the Ninth Ward with water up to their neck, not just for 4 days, for year after year, right? And we don't have any panic of empathy for them. And and it's at the level of the unconscious, and I talk about that.
And so if I was to accept the efficacy argument and the moral argument, or one or the other, frankly, for that matter, how does this play out in a policy level? How does it play out? You're an attorney as well. How does this play out in a courtroom perspective? I know that, you touch on the challenge of how you must approach a jury to get them to sort of recognize that they're dealing with a human being, essentially. But how does this play out in the context of policy? Like, what if we did, as a society, more or less come to the idea of okay, yeah, this is horribly inefficient. This is not working. And there are fall-on effects from this, and to a certain extent, we should talk about your dad on some level as well. But when we put these people away, it's not efficient, but it also creates a lot of suffering that's going on, that ripples out from this, and it implicates individuals and family members, and then the broader community and whatnot. It's also, expensive, and it's in it. And then there's the moral argument. How do we address that from a policy standpoint?
Great. I think starting from a morality standpoint, first and foremost, when we accept that we cannot really judge another's just desserts. I make all kinds of arguments on why we should have epistemic humility about our capacity to judge another's subjective culpability. They're just desserts. Once we accept that epistemic humility, number one, then we have to end the death penalty, right? Because, doubt, Sam, may give your dinner a funny taste, but it's the lack of doubt that goes out and kills. It's the lack of doubt that straps a bomb on her back and walks into the middle of a crowd and detonates. And it's the lack of doubt that straps down a citizen in a chair and injects them with gas or in some other kind of way. So number one, get rid of the death penalty. Number two, Sam, I'm going to be practical. I would say that whatever the crime, I don't care what the crime is. I'm sorry to say it, but whatever the crime, at 12 years, you get a parole hearing. That doesn't mean you get out in 12 years. At 12 years, you get a parole. In Europe and even here in years past in the United States, we had a much different kind of punishment schedule. We've let it go through the roof. We hand out 25 to life like they're candy from a Pez dispenser, on the bench with that gavel. And so, those kind of concrete interventions are the kind of thing, Sam.
I think people would be surprised to hear, is it typical that people don't get a parole hearing in the first 10, 12 years?
Oh, yeah. They can go 25, 35, 45 before they even think about seeing a parole board. They may never see a parole board, right? In other cases, right? Period. So many cases, actually. So, it is, I understand, I understand how let me just put it this way. I understand how much we feel the suffering of the victim. I took my students up to San Quentin. I take them used to on a regular basis, and we sit down with lifers without parole, mothers of murder victims for a day. And here's how it would go, Sam. The mothers of murder victims, the session would go, stand up and say, this is my loved one, ripped from me by murder, somebody like you in this room. right? And this is what it did to our family. And it's heartrending. And she'll pass the pictures around and things like that, and we'll sit there with that, Sam. And then when the lifers will stand up, and let's say he has 10 minutes, he'll spend the first 5 minutes saying, here's the person who I killed, and here's the family I tore apart by that death. And we'll pass that picture around if we have to. We'll sit with that. And then he'll take his last 5 minutes to say, the person who did that act was a depraved individual. Let me tell you how I became that depraved individual. Let me tell you about the foster care. Let me tell you about the cigarette burn. Let me tell you about being put in a car trunk for 6 hours at a time for discipline. Let me tell you about the molestation. Let me tell you about how I got to be that person. And we sit there, Sam, and we realize that the distinction between victims and victimizers isn't so clear. Hurt people, right? And that kind of nuance, we feel the victim's pain, we feel everyone's pain. That's what we got to strive for to really achieve justice in our criminal justice system. That's what I'm trying to get at in this book.
And how do we intervene in the construction of that lifer before they become a lifer? Like how do we not construct someone who is going on to be a victimizer?
Right. We lift them out of those criminogenic conditions before they produce crime, right? If you have stomach rumbling, Sam, and you don't know where your next meal is going to come from, temptation is much more likely to compel you to do something that's outside the boundaries of the law. If we all want a safer society, we've decided that we're going to achieve a safer society. We decided this, maybe after the Great Society experiments of the 60s, we decided that we are going to solve, instead of addressing our social problems head on, we're going to cut the social safety net like Clinton did in the 90s and spend more at the same time on police and jails, right? And so we're going to use the criminal law to deal with poverty. Our poverty governance is we're going to use police and batons and jail cells to address poverty issues rather than making us all safer by making sure we have affordable housing, that we don't have crumbling schools, that we have adequate health care for everyone. And instead of bringing down crime in that way, that's also a safety measure. We spend on more police and more jails and more prisons, right? And because we don't see the connection between our basic social structure and those crimes. A lot of times we just say those are bad people making bad choices rather than we've plunked them down in a situation where all they have is bad choices.